right, let's go on the record. Good morning, everyone. We have counsel present as well as the defendants are present. And we have both juries here in the jury room. There's a few things we'll need to discuss before we bring out both juries. One is with respect to one of the jurors on Mr. Hayes' jury. There was a motion made to strike her because she had become emotional during the testimony on Tuesday, but again on Friday during the medical examiner's office. I'm going to do that. I'm going to call her out in just a moment and talk to her, make sure she's able to continue. So I'm going to make note of the fact that we noticed that she was emotional and wiping tears from her eyes during the medical examiner's testimony when the photographs were shown of young Mr. McClendon, and then reference back to Tuesday as well, and ask her if she feels comfortable continuing on to serve in the case and see what she says. And then if she indicates that she wants to continue, I'm going to tell her that one of the instructions I'll give her is your verdict should not be influenced by feelings of prejudice, bias, or sympathy. Your verdict must be based on the evidence and on the law contained in the instructions, and ask her if she can comply with that instruction. And then we'll again see what she has to say. Does any party have an objection to that approach?
No, Your Honor. No, Your Honor.
All right. The second thing is that we met in chambers, or off the record, about jury instructions. And during that conversation, it was mentioned, Ms. Kite had asked me to reconsider an earlier ruling about Mr. San Juan Bradford's testimony. And during redirect, the state had attempted to elicit from Mr. Bradford a text message that he purportedly sent to Henry Hayes regarding state's theory is the Toyota Corolla that was stolen by Mr. Bradford and that was used subsequently, again, according to the state's theory, in the shooting that led us to today's trial. And Ms. Wright objected as to hearsay grounds. I sustained it. The state's asked me to reconsider that as a prior consistent statement under 98012 to rebut a claim of whether express or implied of recent fabrication or motive to lie. So I wanted to hear that because I know Mr. Bradford is here, and if he's going to testify, we need to get him out. So I know the state's position. Have I correctly stated the state's position first?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, Ms. Wright, your response.
Well, my response is what I argued earlier is that I did not have that portion of his testimony. The portion of his testimony that I was referring to is the fact that he says that he had that I asked him, do you have any proof that my client made a statement? So a statement, well, you want to slide it farther. Additionally, Your Honor, that was asked during the reading.
Any seat's fine. Yeah, any seat's fine. All right, I brought you out. I noticed during Friday's testimony, during the ME, that you were somewhat emotional, and you weren't the only one, right? But you had also been emotional during Tuesday, when the family testified as well. So I just want to make sure that you feel comfortable continuing on with the trial, that you could still sit as a juror and try this and reach a verdict in this case.
Yes, I disregard to contain my motion because I didn't children. But yeah,
Okay. Again, what's that?
I'm good. I had a week to recuperate. I'm okay.
It's an emotional case, and those were emotional photographs. So I'm not saying you can't be emotional, but I just want to make sure you're comfortable going forward. All right. There's an instruction that I'm going to read at the end of the case, and I read this in every criminal case. It says this, that your verdict should not be influenced by feelings of prejudice, bias, or sympathy. Your verdict must be based on the evidence and on the law contained in these instructions. You feel that you can continue to follow that instruction? Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Ms. Lewis. You can return back. We'll be starting in just a few minutes, okay? Ms. Kite, you may call your next witness.
The state will call Detective Scott.
Who's on the swear affirmative? Special need to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
Sir, you testified last week. If you could just reintroduce yourself to the members of the juries.
Good morning. I'm Detective David Scott.
And Detective Scott, are you the lead detective in this homicide investigation involving A.D. McClendon?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
And during the course of your investigation, did you transfer certain items of evidence to two different laboratories for DNA processing?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I want to first focus your attention. Did you transfer the swabs related to the Block 26 to FDLE?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Okay. Did they create what are called extracts
Yes, ma'am.
from their testing?
Yes, ma'am.
What is your understanding of an extract?
My understanding of an extract is it's what's left over when they process the evidence for DNA.
Okay. And did you take those extracts that were left over from FDLE's processing and the additional swabs that were collected by Detective Anthony down to DNA Labs International?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Okay. When you got to DNA Labs International, can you explain to the jury their process of placing descriptions on that evidence?
Basically, we sat down and they entered the items into evidence, and they entered it as Glock 9mm and I believe 9mm magazine, or correction, 9mm gun and 9mm magazine.
Okay. And swabs, 9mm swabs?
Correct.
Okay. And then they also entered Block 26 extracts? The extracts?
Yes, they entered the extracts. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, as it relates to that, did you take any unrelated firearms, that is, some unrelated firearm that we don't have in this case, down to DNA Labs International?
No, ma'am, I didn't.
All right. And the thing that they label as AK swabs, did it come from the MAC 90 that we have over here in evidence?
Yes, ma'am, it did.
Okay, if I may approach you over.
You may.
Sir, I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 299 with the packaging. Is that the Glock 26 that we had, that the swabs were taken from by Detective Amponin?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Okay, and are those the swabs that you have transferred down to DNA Labs International from State's Exhibit 299?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. I don't have any further questions.
Cross.
Good morning, Detective Scott.
Good morning.
So basically, DNA International took the Glock 26 and they called it a 9mm on their extracts. Is that correct?
Correct.
And the MAC 90, they called it an AK-47. Is that right?
It was AK variant, I believe, is the way it was listed on the DNA Labs International receipt.
But it was an AK. They referred to the MAC 90 as an AK. Is that correct?
It was referred to as an AK, but it was the MAC 90 that was recovered from Detective Boland's search warrant.
In other words, DNA International and FDLE, when they're testing the weapons in this case, they're testing those two weapons right there. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
All right. Cross. Redirect.
No, Your Honor.
All right. May this witness be excused.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you, Detective. You're excused.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. Call your next witness.
You're going to state with the next call, Pete Lardizabal.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Sir, will you, if I may, Your Honor,
You may.
will you please introduce yourself to the jurors?
My name is Peter Panzika Lardizabal, and
Spell your first and your last name.
the first name is Peter, the last name Lardizabal.
And where are you currently employed?
I work for the City of Jacksonville with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office as the Firearms Laboratory Manager.
And what are your duties as a firearms laboratory manager?
My primary responsibility is to act as the commanding officer of then the unit associated with firearms examination with the sheriff's office. That would include then the examinations of cartridge cases and firearms recovered in events involving the discharge of a firearm.
Okay. And prior to joining the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, were you employed by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
Yes.
In what capacity?
I worked with the Department of Law Enforcement as a senior crime laboratory analyst and was employed from the fall of 1980 through the end of May 2016.
And can you please explain what your duties were with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
My primary responsibility in the latter portion of my employment with the department was to examine physical evidence submitted by law enforcement agencies in matters involving firearms. So that would include then the examination of firearms themselves, ammunition components that had been actually fired. So that would include cartridge cases, fired bullets, and other items that can be produced in the course of discharging a firearm. I would also examine garments where gunfire may have struck the actual garment in question, items for tool mark examination such as, say, a broken shackle or forced door where perhaps a pry bar or bolt cutter was employed, and perform those examinations.
And please explain your training experience that allows you now to work for the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office and your training experience as it related to your duties with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement.
Well, I received a Bachelor of Science degree with a major in chemistry from the University of Miami back in 1979. After graduating from the university, I was employed by a private laboratory as a chemist for about a year in Tampa, Florida. That's Thornton Laboratories. And then I was employed by the Department of Law Enforcement in the fall of 1980 as a crime laboratory analyst. I worked in the capacity as a crime laboratory analyst and senior crime laboratory analyst in toxicology examinations until the fall of 1991. At that time, I cross-trained in the field of firearm and tool mark examinations. The training program is a 2-year program dedicated to provide the candidate the necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities to examine physical evidence involving firearms. So this would include then the history of firearms examination, microscopic study of fired components, firearms themselves, ammunition components, full theory of then identification, distance determinations, tool mark examinations, serial number restorations. And at the conclusion of this training program, which is a full-time dedicated program, I was given a board examination and was then certified by the Department of Law Enforcement as a firearm and tool mark examiner. Since completing my initial training, I've continued those studies till the present time, including having published papers dealing with subject matter relevant to the field of firearm and tool mark identification. I also served when I was with the Department of Law Enforcement from about 1995 until my retirement from the department in 2016 as one of the primary instructors for new examiners conducting firearm and tool mark examinations.
Will you please, have you testified numerous times as an expert in the area of firearms, both in identification and the components related to ammunition?
Yes.
Can you give the jury a rough figure?
Roughly 370 times to date.
Okay. Now, in this case, were you asked to examine items of evidence related to the death of Aiden McClendon?
Yes.
Okay. Explain to the members of the jury the firearm itself. What is a semi-automatic firearm?
The semi-automatic firearm is one designed to discharge a cartridge with a single pull of the trigger. Typically, this type of firearm employs a reservoir for ammunition known as a magazine. and the magazine contains then multiple, or can contain multiple cartridges. Briefly, a cartridge is a modern unit of ammunition. The layperson may refer to it as a bullet, but it's actually technically known as a cartridge. A cartridge is made of 4 components. You have the cartridge case, which is the outer container. The bullet itself is loaded to the front of the cartridge case. On the inside of the cartridge case is where the gunpowder or propellant is actually located. And in the back portion of the cartridge case is a primer. The primer serves the same purpose as a spark plug does in your automobile engine. And once it is initiated by the firing pin of the firearm, it will combust. On the inside of that cartridge case then, a flame is produced by that primer and ignites the gunpowder. The gunpowder burns at a very high rate of speed, causing an immense amount of gas under high pressure then. It forces the bullet down the barrel and out of the gun. In the semi-automatic firearm operation, the firearm will harness some of this energy due to the discharge of the cartridge to actually fundamentally operate the mechanism of the firearm. And so once a firearm of the semi-automatic design has been fired, the cartridge case will automatically have the cartridge case will automatically be removed and ejected from the firearm in the course of this operation. The bullet having traveled out of the gun and now the cartridge case having been removed, a series of springs can then return the firing mechanism to the forward position, reloading the firearm with a fresh cartridge from the magazine, and then the operator simply needs to release the trigger and then press it again. So it's very important to understand that in the semi-automatic operation, and there are a couple different mechanisms within semi-automatic systems, to fire a cartridge requires a single pressing of the trigger for each shot to be fired. This is different than a fully automatic firearm, where if you press the trigger and hold it to the rear, the cycle of operation continues until you either exhaust your ammunition supply or you release the trigger. But in semi-automatic fire, it requires one separate pressing of the trigger for each shot to be fired.
Your Honor, if I have me 1 moment to switch to the media.
You may.
Mr. Lardizabal, I'm going to show you a demonstrative with the components of the cartridge case to help for you to explain the different components that you've just gone over. If I may just have a demonstrative displayed for the jurors.
You may.
Can you tell the members of the jury what this is?
This is a photograph that I prepared a number of years ago to demonstrate then the typical components of a cartridge, a modern unit of ammunition. This particular one happens to be a 9mm Luger caliber designation, but you can see a cylindrical body on the upper portion of the display colored in brass. That's a cartridge case, and that serves as the container then for the ammunition components. The feature that's the copper-colored object on the upper portion of the photograph on the right side, that's the actual bullet itself that would travel down the barrel of the firearm and out of the gun as it was fired. The bottom portion of the photograph is a cross-section of then a cartridge. And one can see in the center of the cartridge the granules of propellant, or otherwise known as gunpowder. The primer can be seen in the left-hand view of this cutaway cartridge on the bottom of the photograph. And typical construction of a jacketed bullet can be seen in this cross-section design where we have an exterior core, an exterior jacket, in this case made of copper, and the inner portion of the bullet itself in this particular design is a core made of lead. Now, this construction design can vary widely depending on the ammunition at hand. So you can have jackets made of steel, cores made of steel. You can have cores made of plastic, aluminum, many other different materials. And again, the jackets can also be made of many different materials to include plastics, nylon-coated objects, aluminum, steel, brass is even encountered in ammunition components.
Okay. And so once a semi-automatic firearm is actually fired and the person pulls the trigger, what is typically left over from the cartridge?
One will find the cartridge case having been extracted and ejected from the firearm normally on the ground, and the bullet will go down range, striking whatever object it was aligned with.
Okay. In this case, were you asked to look at two firearms, that is a Glock 26 and then a Mac 90?
There, I did examine a Glock Model 26 semi-automatic handgun, and I did examine a 7.62 by 39 caliber Norinco MAK 90.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Mr. Lardizabal, I'm going to first show you State's Exhibit 299 with the packaging. Let us know if you recognize this, and is this the Glock 26 that you examined?
I do recognize this container, and I also examined the firearm. I can do so by a laboratory number unique to this portion of the investigation. The Department of Law Enforcement catalogs their evidence and assigns identification numbers to them, and the laboratory number on this matter involving the handgun is 2016-040-1015. And I personally marked this particular firearm with my initials. The exhibit number, my exhibit number is 1-1 in this particular one, and the laboratory number and the magazine I've also marked with my magic marker with the same information.
Okay, thank you. Your Honor, may I next approach with the second firearm?
You may.
Mr. Lardizabal, I'm going to show you first the packaging, okay?
All right.
Okay.
I can recognize this container by the laboratory number 2016-040-1689 and my markings which are present on the container, including evidentiary seals.
And then,
And I do recognize the magazine in this particular matter. It bears my markings, also placed on there by myself with a permanent marker, and then the firearm that I examined in this particular matter too.
and for the record, I was showing the witness what's been entered as State's Exhibit 298. So you recognize State's Exhibit 298?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Your Honor, may I ask that the witness step down?
You may. You may, sir. Yes, sir.
If I may publish State's Exhibit 299 first.
You may.
Mr. Lardizabal, I'm going to allow you to handle this firearm. If you could, stand on my left side, please. Can you explain to members of the jury what they're looking at in State's Exhibit 299? You can take it out if you want.
This is a Glock Model 26 semi-automatic firearm. The caliber of this particular firearm is 9mm Luger, and the serial number of this firearm is SUF 510. In my left hand is a magazine typically employed in this particular type of firearm. It is in fact a Glock manufactured magazine. The layperson may refer to this as a clip, but it's actually a magazine. A magazine is distinguished by a spring and a follower, so this particular type of design is actually technically a magazine.
And are magazines interchangeable in between weapons? Like, can you have an extended magazine? Can you put in a shorter magazine in this type of firearm?
Different firearms can have different capacity magazines. In this particular design with the Glock, the compact model or subcompact models can employ magazines from the full-size cousins. So the Glock Model 17 has a larger capacity magazine, and it will work with this particular type of firearm. So just because the magazine protrudes from the bottom of the firearm doesn't mean it won't work with it necessarily.
Okay. And this Glock type of firearm, can you purchase other accessories such as a laser or flashlight that you can attach to this weapon?
Many different firearms are compatible with aiming devices. The Glock models can be fitted with accessory sights and other components, either by attaching them to the grip or to the slide or to the forward portion of the trigger guard, and they can be removed at a later date.
If a laser sight was placed on the trigger part, did you have any idea whether it was there or not?
Not
Did you know if it was
necessarily.
removed?
Right. Many of the mount designs are such that you can install them and then remove them and not have any signs that there was a prior accessory installed on the device.
Okay, and is this firearm a semi-automatic?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And did you do a test on this firearm to see if it was in fact functional?
Yes, I actually did test fire this in the course of my examination with the laboratory.
And when you test fire firearms and the ammunition, do you keep that ammunition to see if you can compare it to other questioned ammunition that might be submitted by the sheriff's office?
Certainly.
And did you do that in this case?
Yes, I did.
Thank you. I don't know. Mr. Lardizabal, could you bring out the 99 results? Yes. Images. And if I may be published, State's Exhibit 298 for the jurors.
You may.
Okay. Mr. Lardizabal, help us understand what we're looking at.
This is a 7.62 by 39 caliber semi-automatic rifle, and it is manufactured by Repo, which is a Chinese manufacturer of firearms, and sold here in the United States under the name MAK-90. This is a semi-automatic firearm and would have been initially sold with the stock assembly in the rear so the operator could stabilize the firearm with their shoulder. But the stock has been removed and altered. As a matter of fact, it's been cut. And there are pieces of tape then serving to protect one's hand that was removed on the back portion.
The stock would have been.
Yes, the stock would have been in this space between my left hand and the back of the firearm itself. Matter of fact, this tab on the back has a hole in it, and that's actually used to fasten that portion of the stock to the firearm with a screw, and it still remains.
Okay. And so this firearm has been altered in some way?
Oh, yes, it is.
Okay, and then I'm holding up the magazine. Can you explain what this is?
This is a reservoir for ammunition for this particular type of firearm, or one that can be used in this type of firearm. The size of the magazine, the capacity varies, They can be found with a capacity as small as 5 cartridges. This particular one has a capacity of 40 cartridges, which is a Chinese design and designation. And it is compatible and was used to test-fire this particular rifle.
And show them where the magazine would have been inserted on this weapon?
Certain. In this particular firearm, there is a large opening in front of the trigger guard area, and that's called a magazine well. The magazine is inserted in the forward portion and then locked in place.
And then that magazine, is that sometimes referred to as a banana clip?
Generically, it could be referred to as that, yeah.
Thank you. And you indicated earlier that this is in fact a semi-automatic firearm?
That is correct.
And so even though it's altered, this firearm fire, it's all rusty and stuff, does it in fact fire?
I did in fact test fire this particular firearm, and it does require a single and separate pull of the trigger for each shot that is to be fired.
Thank you. Thank you. If you could retake the stand. I asked you whether you test fired both of these firearms. Did the sheriff's office, in addition to submitting these 2 firearms, also submit what are referred to as casings, and then also the projectile portions of some ammunition that was fired and recovered from various scenes?
Yes.
Okay. Can you explain to the members of the jury, when you initially look at the components of a cartridge, what is the process that you go through to identify, number one, whether it is in fact a portion of a cartridge and whether it has value for your analysis?
One of the primary considerations in examining fired components is to attempt to determine the class characteristics of that component before conducting any additional examinations. Class characteristics are design features that limit something to a smaller group. So if we're to consider, say, an automobile out in the parking lot, and you look at the wheels on an automobile, they'll have a specific size and numerical designation for the tires, even the lug pattern on the rim. Some vehicles might only have 4 lugs, some might have 5, some have 6. And if you were to attempt to put a wheel from one particular vehicle that, say, had a 5-lug pattern onto an automobile that had a 6-lug pattern, it won't fit. Those are class characteristics associated then with an automobile wheel. In firearms identification, class characteristics then are most commonly encountered in a consideration of the caliber of the ammunition and then the design specifications that are observed on different components. So that could include then the style and shape of firing pin, the locations of extractors, ejectors, the internal workings of the firearm, the breech face surfaces, how they're manufactured, the operating systems of the firearms. Do they have a reciprocating slide with a barrel that articulates with it, or do they have a slide assembly with a rotating bolt? Those are all class characteristics. So I'll examine then these fired components, whether they be a cartridge case or a potential bullet or bullet fragment, and attempt to determine those characteristics as best as possible.
And as it relates to the Glock 26, what sort of ammunition does that firearm fire?
Right. The formal designation of caliber here is the 9mm Luger caliber, and that's the name of ammunition that firearms designed to fire. There are actually multiple versions of that names for that same cartridge, but caliber refers to the name of the ammunition. It may or may not have a dimensional consideration that accurately relates back to the ammunition.
Okay. And what about the MAK or MAC-90?
That particular firearm is designed to fire the 7.62 by 39 millimeter cartridge, and that is an intermediate rifle cartridge.
May I approach the witness?
You may.
I'm going to show you what's been introduced as State's Exhibit 351. What caliber of ammunition is that?
Okay, I do recognize this particular item. It bears laboratory number 2016-040-0672. My initials and other markings are present on the container. And this particular cartridge is a 223 Remington caliber cartridge.
Okay, and is that another type of rifle round?
That is another intermediate range rifle cartridge, yes.
Can State's Exhibit 351, the 223 round, be fired in the MAC-90 that we have in evidence?
No.
Why not?
It's incompatible in the same fashion that the wheel analogy we discussed earlier, where you have a 5-lug pattern versus a 6-lug pattern. You can't fit a wheel onto another vehicle like that. In a similar manner, that particular cartridge is incompatible dimensionally with then the 7.62 by 39 caliber MAK-90 that I examined.
Your Honor, may I approach again?
You may.
So I'm going to show you what's been introduced into evidence as State's Exhibit 352 and then 353.
All right. And I do recognize both of these, having previously examined them under laboratory number 2016-040-0672. They bear, my markings are present on all these containers, and they contain ammunition that I examined in this particular case.
And those two exhibits that we've just been talking about, is this 7.62 by 39, is that able to be fired in State's Exhibit 298, the MAC-90?
All of these cartridges are compatible with that particular firearm, yes.
Okay. And now showing you State's Exhibit 354. Are those 9mm live rounds?
These are all 9mm Luger caliber cartridges, and I don't see any of my markings present on this container, so I don't believe I've seen any of these prior to today.
Okay, but the 9mm Lugers, would those be able to be fired in the Glock 26?
That ammunition is compatible with the Glock 26 firearm that I examined.
Now, I asked you earlier whether you examined items of evidence that you determined not to be bullets in this case. Is that accurate?
There were a number of items that I did examine that ultimately were not portions of bullets.
Your Honor, may I approach again?
You may.
I'm showing you State's Exhibit 334, 336, and then 338. Do you recognize those?
I can recognize all of these particular items. The laboratory number I've been referring to, ending in 0672, is present on all of these, as are my particular markings and initials also on seals that I placed on these particular containers.
Okay, and if I just may for the record, State's Exhibit 338, that refers to fragments from the back rear passenger seat, is that correct?
That is correct.
And then State's Exhibit 336, that refers to the fragments from the rear passenger door bullet hole 3?
Correct.
Okay. And then State's Exhibit 334, that refers to unknown fragment front passenger seat near back rest.
That is correct.
Okay. Did you determine that these were not part of a cartridge?
They're not portions of a bullet, that is correct.
A bullet, I'm sorry. Can you explain why? How do you know that?
The construction of bullets is such that then the circumference of the bullet, its actual formation, materials present, and then markings that may be left on the sides of the bullet after it passes down the barrel of the firearm can often be found then on remaining fragments, even very small ones. And in this particular situation, none of these fragments were consistent with any component of a fire bullet.
Okay. And did you also examine items of evidence that you deemed to be no value?
Correct.
Okay. Can you explain what no value that conclusion refers to?
Right. In the examination of evidence, one evaluates those items not only for class characteristics, but also to determine if there's any information remaining on the surface of these items that could be useful for comparison purposes. It's very common for a bullet to become damaged to the point to where, although one can still determine it's a bullet and what caliber and potentially even the type of firearm it was fired from, markings from the barrel may be obliterated or damaged to the point that they become fundamentally of no value for identification purposes.
Your Honor,
You may.
I'm going to show you what's been admitted into evidence as State's Exhibit 355, which is referenced as coming from an unknown size fragment. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. In State's Exhibit 337, that is referenced fragment inside passenger front seat back.
I do recognize this container also.
In State's Exhibit 335, it's represented as coming from unknown fragment front passenger floorboard.
I do recognize this also.
State's Exhibit 333 is coming from unknown fragment from bullet hole 9.
I do also recognize this particular item.
State's Exhibit 319, which is represented as an unknown fragment.
And I also recognize this container and item.
And State's Exhibit 317, which is labeled unknown projectile.
And I do also recognize this particular item.
All of the exhibits that I've handed up to you, what was your conclusion as it relates to those items of evidence?
But they don't contain markings of any value for comparison purposes. So although they are components and portions of bullets, they do not bear any markings of value for identification purposes.
In some of the items of evidence that you analyzed, did you make a further finding that the results that you looked at were inconclusive?
Yes.
Okay, can you explain what that means?
In the course of examining these items and finding marks potentially of value for comparison purposes, I will then appropriately compare the component back to tests that I actually fire with the question firearms and do that with a comparison microscope. Comparison microscope briefly is an instrument that I employ that has actually two microscopes linked by an optical bridge. And this affords me the opportunity to view these two different objects simultaneously in the same field of view. So if you think about your computer monitor in front of you here, if you drew a line right down the middle, and on one half of the screen, you're viewing microscopically the surface of one cartridge case or bullet, and on the other side, a test that I had fired with one of the firearms in question. I can then look at these surfaces and find areas that either may or may not correspond. And those tool marks are what I'm looking at that to try and determine if there's a relationship between the question object and the test that I actually fired. The amount of information present may be sufficient for conclusive findings, or it may not be, sufficient for that. It may fall below that level necessary for identification purposes. You could almost liken it to having sufficient funds to purchase something. If you go to the grocery store and let's say at a electronics store and you wanted to buy some object and it costs $1,000 and you only had $850, you can't purchase the object. Identifications work in a similar manner then, that if there's not sufficient information in these markings present, one can't go to the level of an identification.
Your Honor, may I have the witness step down?
You may.
May I acknowledge a few exhibits?
Yes, ma'am.
Permission to move back?
Yes, sir.
You can stand over here on my left side again. And for the record, I'm showing the witness States Exhibit 340, 341, and 331. Do you recognize these items of evidence?
Yes, I do. Again, the laboratory number 2016-040-0672 is present on all these containers, as are my markings that I placed on the containers as I had occasion to examine them.
And then as it relates to these three bullets, can you explain to the jurors what they're looking at?
All three of these bullets are a designation known as a full metal jacket style bullet. And that is the outer container, outer shell of the bullet itself is made of a harder metallic piece of material than the inner core. In this particular case, they're brass. And on the inside, there's actually a lead interior, lead core. And all three of these have had impact damage to them, but they do retain some level of markings on the sides of the bullet, showing that they were fired down the barrel and out of an actual firearm.
Okay. And did these three bullets, did you conclude that they're inconclusive?
That is correct.
Did they share class characteristics that are similar to the firearms in this case?
These particular bullets are a 9mm designation type, and class characteristics. Generically, they fall under a broader category of 38, but this particular set actually is consistent in the 9mm type, and they bear portions of rifling engravings, right-hand twist, and a polygonal style rifling, which is interesting in that the rifling designs predetermined by the manufacturer use on the insides of barrels. This is a system typically seen then in the block firearms.
And so even though you're not able to conclusively determine that they were fired with Glock 26, they do still contain information indicating that Glock firearm fired these.
They do have class characteristics to suggest that.
He's shown you what's been entered into evidence in State Exhibit 329.
All right.
Okay. You recognize this exhibit?
Yes, I do. It bears the same laboratory number, 2016-040-0672. My initials are present, and also on this other container.
Okay. Can you tell the members of the jury what they're looking at in this exhibit?
This is a fired bullet that belongs to the 7.62 or 30 caliber class family of bullets. It is designed to be fired from a rifle. And it bears rifling engravings of 4 lanes and grooves right-hand twist. You can see damage to the nose portion, and the bottom would be the base portion, which has been loaded into the cartridge itself.
Okay. And what were your findings, ultimate conclusions on this particular bullet?
Okay. That particular one was identified as being fired from the MAK rifle in this particular matter.
So it's a conclusive match.
Correct.
Showing you State's Exhibit 325. Are you able to recognize this?
Yes, I do. Again, I can recognize it very easily. My markings are present, my initials, and then the laboratory number 2016-040-0672.
Okay. And what were your findings as it relates to this bullet?
And that was also identified to the MAK rifle examined in this matter. This particular item has been badly damaged and does not include the totality of the bullet itself. You can see it's been torn and mangled, so to speak, no longer contains the fundamental core of the inside. But the exterior portion of the bullet is what was in contact with the inside of the barrel of the firearm, and that's what I examined then for the comparison.
So this is a conclusive match.
That is correct.
I'm going to show you the State's Exhibit. It's a composite on this that it's been entered separately, 315, 318, 322, and 328.
All right, I do recognize all of these then as items I've examined in this particular matter involving the laboratory number 2016-040-0672, all these containers as are my markings.
And what were your findings as it relates to these bullets?
There are inconclusive findings with respect to these particular items. They're all portions of bullets that are in that 38 9mm caliber class family. The type of rifling system is the same as is employed in the Glock firearm, but there were not sufficient markings present to find conclusively whether they were fired or not fired with that particular Glock firearm.
Thank you. We've been talking about the bullet portions of the cartridge. Now I want to talk to you about shell casings. Did you have the opportunity to compare shell casings from essentially two different locations from where the police gathered them from? That is State's Exhibit. Okay, State's Exhibit. Could you just go through this with me? State's Exhibit 346, 347, 348, and then 349, all those represented as coming from a suspect vehicle.
I did examine these particular items. I can recognize the exterior containers again by the laboratory number 2016-040-0672. My markings are present on all these containers, these items. And these are fired cartridge cases in the 9mm Luger caliber designation that I examined in this particular matter.
Okay. And what were your findings as it relates to those casings?
In comparison, markings then on these computer cartridge cases, back to tests that I fired personally with the firing question, I determined that all 4 of these cartridge cases were fired with the Glock 26 that I examined in this matter.
Okay, so these casings match that firearm that we have in evidence.
They were all fired in that firearm, that's correct.
Okay, conclusively,
Yes.
right? If you could, go back in. And then I'm going to show you what's been entered into evidence as the exhibit 300, 301, 302, 303, 304, 305, 306, and 307. Do you recognize that?
I do recognize these containers and the computer cartridge cases in this matter. My markings are present on all these computer items, and each and every one of these containers bears the same laboratory number we've been referring to, that is 2016 0400672.
Okay, and what were your findings as it relates to these exhibits?
And I determined that all 8 of these cartridge cases were in fact fired with the Glock Model 26 that I examined in this particular case.
Thank you.
Hold on a second. Yes, sir. Do we need a break? All right, folks, let's take a morning recess. We'll be back at 10:45.